Thanks everyone for the opportunity to participate in this webinar series. And as mentioned, I will be speaking to you about the use of seismological data for research and for hazard assessments. And when I talk about seismological data, I'm talking about recordings of seismic waves that result from vibrations in the earth that can be triggered by an earthquake or a nuclear explosion or a truck going by. But basically, we're really looking at, we want to be recording the signals of earthquakes. I'll be speaking about a number of projects that are supported by IRIS. And for those of you who aren't familiar with IRIS, it is a consortium of more than 100 universities that are dedicated to the operation of scientific facilities that support seismological research. And we also provide an archive for the data. And the funding is primarily from the National Science Foundation. So before I talk about the uses of the data, I just wanted to give a brief description of the main components of a seismic station. And in the lower left and lower right photos of this slide, you can see what's called a seismometer, which is the instrument that actually records the ground motion. They come in a number of varieties. For the projects I'm talking about, we use very high quality instruments. They're generally installed underground in either a vault inside a tunnel or a borehole up to 100 meters deep. The station generally has its own power and infrastructure with computers that actually do local data collection. And then in most cases, the data is telemetered in real time over a satellite link or an internet link to a central collection facility. So I'll be focusing mainly on something called a global seismographic network. This is sort of the gold standard of seismic networks because of the quality of the instrumentation and also the quality of the installations. It's a network of about 152 stations distributed globally, as you can see on this map. And it's actually a joint project between IRIS, funded by the NSF, and the USGS. IRIS operates about a third of those stations. Those are shown in red on this map. And then the USGS operates about 100 of these stations. And we also get contributions from a number of international networks, but they basically operate those stations. So once the data is recorded, it's sent to the IRIS DMC facility in Seattle, Washington. And in this plot, you can see how the archive has grown and how big the archive is, and we're almost up to 450 terabytes. We archive not just GSM data there, but also a number of other networks, and we are getting data on a daily basis. Now you'll notice that if you look at the blue area that represents the GSM data that's been archived over 20 years, it's a small amount in proportion to the total archive. However, it is one of the most requested data sets because of the quality of the data. So this plot shows actually the data distribution over time, and you can see that again, this is increasing, and the data is distributed not only within the United States, but to researchers and policymakers in over 173 countries around the world. The key is that all of the data are free and openly available, and that is actually one of the requirements to archive your data in this facility. So the GSM network is a prime example of a facility that's used by and supported by a number of different agencies. So I mentioned that this network is a partnership between IRIS, funded by the National Science Foundation, and also the USGS, which uses the data, but there's a number of other agencies that periodically contribute to the network or funds to the network to assist in modernization efforts and infrastructure improvements that will benefit the particular missions of the agency. So it could, the Air Force is interested in monitoring for nuclear tests. The Department of Energy is interested in seismic hazards around nuclear power plants. So because of their missions, they're particularly interested in keeping this network going and having continual access to the data. Another thing about this network is that it's built up of partnerships with a number of foreign countries. We wouldn't be able to have these stations all over the world if we didn't have these long-standing relationships, and some of these are over 20 years old. There's also national organizations. I'll talk a little bit more about the tsunami warning centers and how this data is used, and also the National Earthquake Information Center. Both these organizations assist with the cost of the telemetry and also the equipment that's involved to get the data to the archive. So what do we use these data for? Well, there's numerous applications. The first is for fundamental research of global Earth structure and understanding how earthquakes actually work. And I show two examples here. On the left are a number of sections through different layers in the Earth on the order of thousands of kilometers. And the different colors you see represent the different velocities that the seismic waves are traveling as they move through the Earth. And these colors can be correlated with changes in the physical properties of the interior, and in turn we can relate these to large-scale structures such as plate boundaries, locations of volcanoes, and subduction zones. On the right you see a series of panels. This was recorded after the magnitude 9 Tohoku earthquake in 2011, and from this we can see where actually the earthquake started at 10 seconds, and then you can see how the rupture propagated over the next 2 minutes. And this gives us some understanding of how earthquakes behave, how much rupture area is related to the magnitude of the earthquake, and so forth. So of course everybody knows, I think has heard about the National Earthquake Information Center, which reports when there are large earthquakes around the world and in the US. So this plot just shows the number of magnitude 5 and greater earthquakes that have been recorded by this network in the last 8 years. The triangles represent the locations of the GSM stations, and the purpose of this network is really to capture the large earthquakes around the world. It's not so much for local or regional seismicity, because there are a number of seismic networks that already do that. Other monitoring applications, as I mentioned, the tsunami warning system uses the data from these stations to issue warnings that tsunami may be occurring after a large earthquake. And the 2004 Sumatra earthquake is shown, the stations used at that time are shown on this map. And so 100 of the GSM stations are actually used in real time by these agencies to determine the potential for a tsunami. It's also, the network is also used for verification seismology, meaning we can actually detect whether nuclear explosions are being tested, because the signal looks very different for for an earthquake versus an explosion, but basically you're still recording a vibration in the earth. And this plot here just shows basically four recordings at a GSM station of nuclear blasts that were done in Korea, including the one in January of this year. And you can see they basically overlap except for maybe the amplitude of or the size of the explosion. But it tells us that they were very similar events and they were in the same general location. So seismic networks operate on a large variety of scales depending on the size and location of earthquakes you're interested in. And the U.S. has a number of regional networks mainly operated by the U.S. Geological Survey. Beginning in 2003, the NSF funded a 10-year project called Earthscope. And as part of this, over 1,600 stations were deployed over the continental U.S., as shown in this map. And each one of these dots represents the location of a seismic station. And the different colors represent the years where those stations were there. And the purpose of this network was basically to do a CAT scan of the structure underneath the United States. But it also recorded earthquakes happening in the U.S. over that time period. And this just shows a plot of the data collected in terms of the earthquake locations. And as expected on the West Coast, there's a lot more earthquakes, but you can see that in eastern and central U.S. there's quite a few earthquakes going on as well. And there traditionally have not been as many regional networks to cover that area. So a number of government agencies came together and looked at the existing networks, which are shown in black circles on this. And they said, well, we've spent all this money building these other stations. We could actually double our monitoring capability with these newly built stations. And it serves a number of purposes for the different agency needs. So the Nuclear Regulatory Commission can monitor seismicity around nuclear power plants, and you can look at things like seismicity related to fluid injection operations and that sort of thing. So this was a great opportunity to use this data for a number of different needs. So just hopefully I've convinced you of the value of seismological data as a national asset, and that the data can be used for fundamental research, both of the Earth structure and how earthquakes occur. We can determine the location, magnitude, and distribution of them and relate that to local phenomena or global phenomena. It's used for hazard warning and for basically defense of the United States in terms of the nuclear explosions. And then, as with any scientific data set, sometimes you don't even know what else you'll see, and I've listed a couple of examples here of other things that we've seen with this data. Thank you.